Hello and welcome to another episode of The Novel Brain with Dr. E. Today I'm going to discuss with you Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but particularly focusing on the areas of self-actualization and self-transcendence, which later was developed at the tail end of Maslow's life and also thought as his revered work. So stay tuned. So in this time of a pandemic, I think it's absolutely important to focus on where we are within this hierarchy of needs to get a better assessment of what we need and also start to consider the things that we need for self-fulfillment as we get further along the lines in the hierarchy. So let's talk about the basic needs. We all need food, water, warmth, and rest. And this is the base of the triangle. This is the base of what we need, the physiological needs that we need in order to exist. If we've established our physiological needs, such as our shelter and some food and water to stay alive, we're also going to need safety. The security and safety of living in an environment where you don't feel threatened. Now, these two areas have become increasingly threatened by the virus. People are having socioeconomic issues right now and unable to get food and water, or unable to get the safety that they need, maybe even losing their homes. So this is why I'm covering this today, is the hierarchy of needs is something that is affecting all of us, where we're absolutely having difficulties finding the foundational needs. Now, for those of you who are living in parts of the world where you do have your basic needs accounted for, we may be thinking about our psychological needs. So these are the next two areas: the belongingness and love that we all need as people, our social, intimate relationships, our friendships, also our immediate partnerships, as well as our esteem needs, which is some kind of feeling of accomplishment. Now, these are probably those that are even taking a back burner for many of us because we're also so concerned about getting our basic needs, such as our groceries and our food and water, even delivered to our house. Many of us don't have that option. So psychological needs may be, if you're going to look at the stove methodology, it's possible that these are on the back burner. If they're not, however, there are also needs that are real. So Abraham Maslow would put emphasis on you looking into these areas and improving your outlook, as well as what's happening in these areas for you. So next up at the top of the triangle or pyramid would be the self-fulfillment needs, and this is self-actualization. So self-actualization is basically achieving your own full potential, including all the different creative activities that you do in order to feel self-actualized. And this is one area that I want to focus on in order for us to all kind of understand that you do need some self-actualization in your life to feel fulfilled. And what's really important to acknowledge here is there's a reason why this is a hierarchy, because when you're looking at self-actualization, this is more of a growth need versus the ones below, which are deficiency needs. Now, self-actualization is a growth need from a lack. It does not stem from a lack of something, but rather it's a desire for you to grow as a person. And so people like Carol Dweck, later, more recently, with the growth mindset, she would be speaking a lot to self-actualization. And this has become very popularized in modern psychology. And in fact, Maslow came up with this in 1943, and then later really talked about self-actualization, in the 70s and beyond. People took his work after that and really started working on self-transformation. And that's going to be the focus of the rest of this conversation, is self-actualization was really the top of his hierarchy. It was the importance of his work. And a lot of times you might think that's where people go developmentally into their older age. I know that my own father, who's now 83, really focuses on the meaning of his life. And you can't really speak about the meaning of your life without thinking about your being needs, your growth needs, where you've arrived and where you've come from. So this is all taking into account that your deficiency needs are met and that now you're actually working on these growth needs. So again, the importance of the hierarchy of needs, ever since the first time I set my eyes on this model, back I think in my undergraduate days, was that this is really such a profound piece of information for everybody to know, so that we all have an understanding of life experiences and the things that occur in life that can disrupt or potentially derail you from having a peaceful, regular existence. For example, let's talk about a few different life experiences like a divorce or a loss of a job, or maybe a move that was forced by a hurricane or some kind of natural disaster. And these are things that are going to really derail your physiological and your safety needs. And so this is something that's going to really throw off your equilibrium as far as living. So let's take, for example, the pandemic. And I know I spoke briefly about this, and this is just to reiterate that we're looking at people losing physiological and safety needs. So it's almost like if you had a house built on a foundation, you no longer have that foundation, and you're basically trying to live on the second floor without the first. So I think your priorities are going to be that you're not going to be considering your love and belonging stages. Maybe you are counting on that and it's helping you. So maybe it's also something that because of your love and belonging stages, you have resources such as family and friends where you can live elsewhere. So looking at it that sense, you do have those needs fulfilled simply because you have family and friends. Now, for example, if you do not have resources or medical care or insurance, we're going to be really hurting in this time. And we have to face it that everybody on this planet is hurting because of this pandemic. And this may be an interesting time. You might be thinking, why are you even covering self-actualization and furthermore self-transcendence in a time of such great need of physical and basic needs, such as getting groceries and income into your account? Well, I'm here to say that I think, to me, I agree with Maslow and have studied him enough to think that his work at the tail end of his life is kind of where I feel I am in my life. In my 40s, thinking about where I've been and where I'm going, and I can't really think too much more about my basic existence without considering and really focusing, as I do almost every day, on my self-actualization as well as my self-transcendence. So I'm going to dedicate this last part of this episode to really just honing in on just exactly what self-actualization is, and ask you a few questions as to where you are. So what I know about the characteristics of self-actualizers is that they perceive reality efficiently and tolerate uncertainty. So self-actualization is something that you can actually recognize within a person. And I've been able to actually notice this among people, and have noticed that a lot of my own close friends and colleagues are self-actualizers. And it is true that I think that birds of a feather do flock together once you see that there's other people who do tolerate uncertainty the same way you do. Perhaps they accept themselves and others for who they are rather than identifying them or judging them. I've noticed a spontaneous thought and action within self-actualizers, and people who are problem-centered and not self-centered. So they actually have solutions and they look for those versus blaming them on others. There's also this unusual sense of humor that self-actualizers have. that you can recognize that's very helpful, and it's been thought that humor is really the way to get through a lot of things. And I'm not minimizing where we are, people. It's not that we have to be trying to laugh our way through a pandemic, but it does help a great deal. Self-actualizers also are very creative, and they're able to look at life objectively. They're resistant to enculturation, but not purposely unconventional. So they're just themselves, and they're concerned for the welfare of everyone versus just looking at myself and how am I going to get through this. And this may be very difficult to do absolutely right now, because we are thinking about how am I going to survive. Well, the self-actualizers are also thinking, how's everyone going to survive this? They're capable of deep appreciation of the basic life experience. And this is something that I think can be very identifiable within people, is that gratefulness, that thankfulness of being just alive, to have another breath, to have another day. And this is not something that we need to take for granted at this time. They look for peak experiences, and things that really heighten them are the things that are giving them optimal experience. So it's really like experience over things and objects. There's this sort of need for privacy, and isolation is actually something self-actualizers like and thrive in when they're thinking, and also when they're doing. So the self-actualizer might be found on a hiking trail and with a journal and processing their thoughts. They're in this different space. There's also this idea of having a democratic attitude towards things, where there's other people that are involved with your decisions and your actions. And therefore, the hierarchy of needs does kind of discuss just the moral, ethical standards of people. And again, what I started off thinking about for this episode was to really focus on what Abraham Maslow really worked on towards the end of his life, and that was self-transcendence. So he died in 1970, and this was thought to be his revered work on his own level, but it's often forgotten. What's important to talk about with self-transcendence is that when Maslow initially developed the hierarchy of needs model, he described several characteristics of self-actualized people, only to later realize that he'd bundled the characteristics of self-transcendent people with those of self-actualized people. So he had thought that self-transcendence was more defined by peak experiences than actual self-actualization. So that's why it became later another apex of his hierarchy of needs. And some of you might be thinking, well, what's the deal with Maslow's motivation model, and where are the cognitive and aesthetic needs? Well, those needs were added as well. And those were put into the growth needs under self-actualization later in the model. So when you're looking at it, you have the 4 basic deficiency needs, and they move into the higher growth needs. And what we're talking about today is really focusing now on the transcendence needs and how self-transcendence became forgotten. Well, this might be this area that as self-actualized individuals get to be more purely in sort of yourself, they're able to fuse with the world. And what is going on here is you're sort of looking for peak experiences, or maybe more spiritual existence, these feelings of limitless horizons that are open up to you. You have visions of the world, and that perhaps you're feeling more powerful amongst yourself and experiencing ecstasy within the day, and wonder and awe. These are the kind of peak experiences that Maslow would describe as being self-transcendent. And I think that the importance of discussing self-transcendence at this time is really focusing on the difference between the self-actualizer, who can experience these apex sort of peak experiences. However, it now just becomes more than just the self. So self-transcendence is the awareness that now there's this even more profound effect on others. And particularly hierarchy of need does not, at its base level, focus on this transcendence experience in looking at the wide variety of other world cultures. And that's why, when introduced in 1970, it was almost this marriage of Western and Eastern culture. So now there's these thoughts of possibly introducing shamanistic tradition, or even looking at Eastern culture in a sense where it's no longer just this individual Western-centric idea of self-actualization. So that now the goal of identity seems to be even more so focused on not just the self. So what happened to self-transcendence, and why did this later added apex disappear or become forgotten altogether? Well, there's almost like this sort of revisionist history, and if you look at things in history, oftentimes people look at like the first model and not the later models, but it might have just been simply bad timing for Maslow, as he first started to conceptualize this in 1967 and he died in 1970 from a heart attack. So it was like later in his life when this was added. And he also did not publish a whole lot in journals about this. But I think the third reason why it did not really stick and is only more recently being put back into the ethos is because it really dipped into the spiritual or mystical. And this is something that typically psychologists avoid all the way up until present day. However, I don't think you can identify or approach a problem set without talking about the spiritual or even the mystical. It's not, to me, embracing pseudoscience and the supernatural, but it's studying the entire existence of a person, the entire dynamic, all the different facets of being human. And that's not just being a human being, it's a human doing, it's a human being all different parts of itself. So to me, self-transcendence is absolutely accepted and something that I focus on very regularly, of course, with my basic needs being met. So in a time of a great pandemic, we definitely have to consider the people who are not able to have those basic needs. Help out, help your fellow person, help your neighbors, your community. The whole world needs help right now. And in my view of the hierarchy of needs, it doesn't need to be flipped, but in order to help others, I feel I have to be in my self-transcendent mode. The person who can reach my peak experiences by volunteering my time and energy to others. And that's really all that you can do. So if we can help out in any way that we can, that focusing on any different area of this model is helpful to identify where you are, but it's also helpful to identify where other people are as well. So it's not a shameful thing that people aren't in different areas of this model, such as the growth areas, but it's good to recognize that if you are, you have a basic skill set that can help others as well as helping yourself. So really, to me, I think the conclusion for this in my end note is that it's really not about just us, even though it feels as if it is. If it feels as if it is, it's true, because right now you are having to focus on getting that next meal or that next paycheck or that next place to live. And these are not given these days. These are not things that are easy. And we've all, to some degree, lost our freedoms within this sort of basic need category. Our physiological needs are being hurt by our health. Our basic needs are being hurt by our economics. And the pandemic and this virus have taken its massive toll on all of our basic needs. So my takeaway for this is that if you are in fact finding yourself in the self-transcendent apex of hierarchy of needs of Maslow's later work in life, then do your part and help others with that self-transcendence, with that ability that you have, with that found person that you found, knowing that you can help others. Okay, so that's it for now. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. There's going to be a lot more coming. I'm very excited to say I've got some special things for next week. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next time.